Dear friends, welcome to E-Pathshala. I am Dr. Vishal Jadhav, Department of Sociology, Tilak Maharashtra Vidyapith, Pune. Today we are going to look at a module named Louis Althusser's ideological state apparatus of the overall paper Political Sociology. Following from the Frankfurt School, Louis Althusser, who is a structuralist Marxist, brought in a concept called the ideological state apparatus, along with another concept called repressive state apparatuses. According to Althusser, the ideological state apparatuses are very subtle forms and practices brought about by the capitalist state to ensure conformity to the normative order of capitalism itself. This module will look into the ideological state apparatus in detail. The state and its apparatuses. The attempt to revise NCERT history textbooks while the NDA was in power at the center in 1980, from 1998 to 2004 might provide us with a useful illustration for discussing Althusser's ideological state apparatuses. One might recall that the attempt to revise textbooks was carried out with the intent of correcting what the BJP saw as distortions introduced by Marxist historians who had come to dominate the social science academia since the 1970s. Through this exercise, the NDA also sought to highlight the roles of national leaders like Shyam Prasad Mukherjee, Sardar Patel, Lal Bahadur Shastri, supposedly ignored by the Congress. That the effort to revise textbooks was criticized as an attempt to saffronize history and was ultimately revoked once the United Progressive Alliance assumed power in 2004 is perhaps besides the point here in the context of this module. What is important is to keep in mind that the books that were sought to be revamped were part of the syllabi at the school level. They were, in other words, part of what Althusser suggests is the core constituency of the ideological state apparatuses, the educational apparatus. But what exactly are the ideological state apparatuses and what are their functions? In order to understand this, we must first concentrate on Althusser's reworking of the classical Marxist notion of the state. In the ideological state apparatuses essay, Althusser observes that the Marxist tradition is strict. The state is explicitly conceived as a repressive apparatus. The state is a machine of repression which enables the ruling class to ensure the domination over the working class. He then goes on to outline the constituents of the machine of repression in the state apparatus: the police, the courts, the army, the prisons, the government, the administration. He says the state apparatuses may survive revolutions and collapses of state. A new dispensation merely takes over the running of this apparatus to suit its end. To the above, Althusser adds another dimension, the ideological state apparatus. He says are clearly on the side of the repressive state apparatus, but must not be confused with it. In order to differentiate the two, Althusser uses the term repressive state apparatuses to refer to state apparatuses as in Marxist theory. He says that while repressive state apparatuses function primarily through repression, punitive action against those who refuse to fall in line is very much part of RSA's ideology and only secondarily through repression. The key constituents of the ideological state apparatuses according to Althusser are the religious ISA, the educational ISA, the family ISA, the legal ISA, the political ISA, the trade union ISA, the communications ISA, the cultural ISA. Despite the plurality of ideological state apparatuses, they are unified by ideologies through which they function. In all the ISAs, the set of ideological discourses at work is always dominated by the ruling ideologies, which are ideologies of the ruling classes of societies in which they have developed. The role of the repressive state apparatus lies in securing by force the political conditions of the reproduction of relations of production, which in effect are relations of exploitation. For instance, in the capitalist system, the police may detain a poor person who steals from a rich person, as the former has no right over the hard-earned material possessions of the latter. The judiciary may then prosecute him, put him behind bars for several years. ISAs, on the other hand, work behind the shield. To secure the reproduction of the relations of production, for instance, in the earlier example, ISAs through lessons in morality and civics would teach us not to steal, to respect the property of others, and to recognize that we have no rights over others' properties even though they may possess much more than we do. Althusser considers the educational apparatus as the core of ideological state apparatuses in the contemporary period. The educational apparatus has replaced the church of the medieval period in terms of many of its functions. In fact, while church family dio was the most important constituent of the ISAs earlier, it has been replaced by the school family dio in contemporary times. This is because the school takes in children at their most impressionable age and subjects them to liberal doses of ruling ideology through subjects like history, civics, morals, philosophy, etc. The school attempts to teach children proper ways of behavior, ways of talking, interacting, thinking, and acting. The educational apparatus ejects at every stage a group of individuals who are best suited to fulfill specific roles in capitalist society. At 16, most leave to become workers. Later, they leave to become lower and middle managers. They become typically the agents of the exploitation with an ability to give the workers orders and speak to them human relations. Yet later, they leave to become finance capitalists, managers, politicians, and professional ideologists with the ability to give orders and enforce obedience without discussion. It will be wrong to assume, however, that ruling ideologies enjoy unfettered freedom in ideological state apparatuses. Althusser notes that ISAs are the sites of class struggle, and it is not difficult to see why the ideological state apparatuses, after all, are responsible for the formation of the subject, which lives the ideology in question through its practices. In ensuring that a certain ideology makes its way into the ideological state apparatuses is to ensure that all the individuals who pass through the ISA, which everybody does, believes in that ideology, thereby ensuring the reproduction of the relations of production in keeping with that ideology. It was because of the crucial importance of the ISAs that the church, the most powerful ideological apparatus, was the center of all revolutions at an earlier point in time, as evidenced during the Renaissance and Reformation period. During those times, the church was the fulcrum around which a person's life revolved. Gradually, the power of the church diminished and specialized institutions were formulated to fulfill the functions that were once the domain of the church. Returning to our Indian example, it would not be wrong to suggest that today the school education, that is primary location of struggle, as evidenced in India's attempt to revise history books. Through that effort, it could be argued the NDA sought to make the ideology of Hindutva the backbone of the educational apparatus. This would ensure that the masses ejected out of the apparatus would be ready to serve its interests schooled in the discourse of Hindutva. The importance of the educational ideological state apparatus is also borne out by the fact that entities like the right-wing Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh and the Narmada Bachao Andolan have stressed on schools run by them. It is through their own schools that they sought to produce subjects who would submit to the respective ideologies. It is important to note here that the concept of ideology does not have a negative connotation. Ideologies might be positive or negative depending on how we look at them, but it is not particular ideologies that Althusser is concerned with. Instead, his concept of ideology and its working in ISAs focuses on ideology in general. The contours of ideology. Ideology is the way in which we understand our world, the stories that we tell ourselves to make sense of our lives and ideologies we live in. They are representations of the real that help us order our lives. They exist at the level of the common sense and are taken for granted. Each one of such ideologies is marked by specific histories, specific struggles. Yet, Althusser concerns himself not with specific ideologies, but with ideology in general. This is because ideology has no history in terms of structure and functioning. It is the same throughout history in its various manifestations. In that sense, ideology is omni-historical. This conception of ideology is a departure from the Marxist connotation of ideology present in the German ideology, where ideology is pure illusion, an imaginary construction. Althusser, while speaking of the Marxian notion of ideology, likens it to the pre-Freudian notion of the dream. Before Freud, the dream was considered purely imaginary, empty, null, and arbitrarily stuck together. Marx's notion of this ideology resembles this bricolage. For Marx, ideology has no history of its own because it is constituted by the day's residues like dream. For Marx, ideology has no history in the negative sense. For Althusser, on the other hand, ideology in general has no history in the positive sense. It has no history because it is omnihistorical. In this, Althusser likens his conception of ideology to the Freudian concept of unconscious. Freud proposed that the unconscious is eternal, that is, it has no history. Arriving at a precise notion of ideology in general is important for Althusser because this becomes the basis of his theory. Only ideology in general can help us theorize the workings of the ideological state apparatuses. In discussing particular ideologies, we will remain limited to descriptive theory. For Althusser, descriptive theory is the first phase of theory and essentially a transitional one. For descriptive theory describes the situation as it is at one point in time. As such, then, it is a starting point and one needs to develop the theory in a way that it goes beyond description. Ideology equals illusion or allusion. Like Marx, for Althusser, ideology does not correspond to reality. In other words, it constitutes an illusion. Unlike Marx, however, ideology for Althusser makes an allusion to reality. Althusser says ideology makes an allusion to historical reality, while at the same time constituting an illusion with respect to that reality. It gives a certain knowledge and recognition of a world, but at the same time introduces us to its misrecognition. The task of ideology is then to sense mask our real conditions of existence through a representation of our imaginary relationship with the real conditions of existence. In ideology, one is never aware of one's exploited form of dominant status or for deprivation or superiority is attributed to an imaginary construct. Consider the ideology that legitimated caste hierarchies. Those at the bottom of the caste structure believed that the deprivation was the result of their impure status and owed to the fact that they had emerged from the feet of the creator god Brahma, while purest Brahmins believed in the superiority as they had emerged from Brahma's head. Note that in the Althusserian sense, everybody lives in ideology. It is not an instrumental discourse that the ruling classes, groups conceive in order to deceive the oppressed classes or groups. Although society's ideology consists of the ideology of its dominant classes, all sections of society must believe in the myth. Furthermore, the dominated classes can also produce their own ideologies, which may gradually become part of the society's ideology as various dominated groups are co-opted into the system. In this sense, therefore, ideology is a site for struggle. Through ideology, men do not represent their real conditions of existence to themselves. Rather, what they do is represent their relations to the real conditions of existence. As the above example shows, ideology has a material existence in the sense that it exists in an apparatus and its practices. Taking the example of caste structure once again, the ideology of purity and pollution existed not merely in the consciousness of people, but in their day-to-day actions that were part of an elaborate set of rituals. Upper castes avoided touching or being touched by lower castes, did not eat with lower caste, and considered marriage outside the caste groupings as polluting. Zizek delineates a similarity between Althusser and Michel Foucault. He says that the Foucauldian counterparts, the ideological state apparatuses, are the disciplinary procedures that are operated at the level of micropower and designated at the point at which power inscribes itself into the body directly. However, Foucault never uses the term ideology while speaking of these mechanisms of micropower. He emphasizes how power constitutes itself from below and does not emanate from some unique summit in the form of monarch or some other embodiment of sovereignty. This summit, according to Foucault, emerges as the secondary effect of the plurality of micro-practices of the complex network of their interrelations. Zizek argues Althusser's advantage over Foucault seems evident. Althusser proceeds in exactly the opposite direction. From the very outset, he conceives these micro-procedures as part of the ideological state apparatuses. That is to say, as mechanisms which, in order to be oppressive, to seize the individual, already presupposes the massive presence of the state, the transferential relationship of the individuals towards state power, or in Althusser's term, towards the ideological big other in whom the interpellation originates. This brings us to the other crucial aspect of Althusser's conception of ISA, the notion of interpellation, or the fixing of the subject's position. Interpellation and the subject. We have already mentioned that all of us live in an ideology, and everybody believes in ideology. The free market economist believes in the ideology of the free market, in the promise of growth in urbanization and industrialization, and the withdrawal of government from all functions, save that as the facilitator for business, as does the daily wage laborer who migrates to city for better prospects. The return of this belief in ideology, however, is different for each group. This begs the following question: why would people continue to live in ideology even though it may be detrimental to their prospects? Why would the Dalit continue to believe in ideology of purity and pollution, or why would the clerk in the office believe that he would never occupy the upper echelons of management because he lacks sufficient educational qualification? Althusser says this is possible because ideology is crucial in the process of subject formation, a process that is part of the operation of the ideological state apparatuses. Ideological apparatuses constantly aid in process of subject formation and help create subjects who believe in this ideology. But how is this achieved? Althusser's answer: through the act of interpellation or hailing. He goes on to cite an example to show how the act of hailing constitutes a subject. A person or an individual walking on the road hears a cry, "Hey, you there!" This is the everyday police hailing, hearing which the individual turns around. In the act of turning around, he becomes a subject because he has recognized that the hail was really addressed to him. Through the act of hailing, the individual becomes a subject in two ways, writes Luc Ferreter in Althusser. We become subjects in the philosophical sense, free and responsible centers of thought and action, and in doing so ensure that we remain subjects in the political sense, submissive to the ruling class. It is this submissive subject produced by the ISAs that ensures the reproductions of the relation of production. Experience shows that the hail hardly ever misses the person who is hailed. What takes place here on the street seems to be outside ideology, and yet in reality takes place in ideology. In other words, what takes place in ideology, the act of hailing or interpellation and the constitution of the subject both at the same time, seems to take place outside ideology. This is why those who are in ideology believe themselves to be outside ideology. Further, as ideology is without history, as it is eternal, Althusser says, ideology has already interpellated individuals as its subjects. In doing so, ISAs have already ensured that such subjects are produced who ensure the reproduction of the relations of production, even as they seek to reproduce themselves and the conditions of existence. It could be argued, following Althusser, that modern capitalism, through its ISAs, interpellates individuals and creates subjects out of them. These subjects identify themselves in ways that provide for the continuance of capitalist exploitation. ISAs serve capitalism by interpellating subjects within meaning systems that make them accept their exploitation. Questions of agency. Althusser's conceptualization of the subject is not without limitation. For to turn around and answer the hail or the interpellation of law is to grant the ideological apparatus the recognition that we occupy the place it has designated for us. The subject of ideology then is mere puppet, conscious of beliefs produced by a set of practices over which it has no control. According to the schema, we exist as part of a mechanized reality in which we are imprisoned in a web of rituals, and ideology conceals from us our existence as mindless automaton. Althusser's theory of ideology and subject formation denies any agency to the individual immersed in a complex set of practices within the various ISAs. He becomes exactly what ideology wants to make him. From this standpoint, it is difficult to see how ISAs may become the site of struggle, as Althusser insists they are. However, he does not answer the crucial question: if subject positions are fixed through interpellation, how do the exploited classes find the wherewithal to express itself, to see through this ideology? Further, Althusser's arguments that ISAs are sites of bitter forms of class struggles assumes great importance when we examine Indian society. As has been argued among others by Untitled, capitalism in India has built on previously existing divisions. Teltumde provides example of how caste has become substituted by class under capitalism. Low castes have been economically worse off than the upper castes, and under capitalism this division has become economized. We can see therefore how societies or social formations comprise multiple interacting structures. In case of India, instead of a purely capitalist class struggle, structure, we have elements of the earlier feudal casteist order, as well as vast numbers of people who exist as part of the informal sector. Following Althusser, these various groupings try to exert their influence on the ISAs. Their influence in institutions like family, religion, and schools is different. We therefore have a situation where an individual may be subject to several, often conflicting instances of interpellation. How does then one account for the unity of ISAs as Althusser poses? Althusser's interest in ideology as interpellation is shared by Ronald Barthes. While writing in a different context about myths, Barthes says, "For this interpellent speech is at the same time a frozen speech. At the moment of reaching me, it suspends itself, turns away, and assumes the look of a generality. It stiffens, it makes itself look neutral and innocent." For Barthes, ideological interpellation takes place through a language that at a very moment of hailing an individual as its target suddenly repositions itself and speaks instead to a generic addressee, as if the personal trajectory of its call had been an illusion all along. Ideological language arrests us in both the physical and the legal sense of the term. Like Barthes, Althusser's notion of interpellation also gets trapped in a language game. We must accept the rules of the language and its obviousness in order to be able to recognize ourselves. In the event that we may be made aware of the functioning of ideology, we may respond saying, "That's obvious," yet the obviousness becomes obvious only with the utterance of those words. For Barthes and Althusser, the individual who becomes a subject is, in a sense, imprisoned by a discourse that may never speak to, for, or about it. Further, as Judith Butler writes in The Psychic Life of Power, the call Althusser speaks of arrives severally in implicit ways. Even if one were to accept that Althusser's scene is allegorical, it is unclear what guarantees the fact that the individual would always already turn around and be constituted as a subject. The turning around, for that matter, depends not only on the voice of the law, but also the responsiveness of the one hailed by law. The turning around is not determined unilaterally or exclusively either by the law or the addressee. For although there would be no turning around without first having been hailed, there would also be no turning around without some readiness to turn. The question is, why would the addressee turn around when it involves accepting a certain guilt. For let us remember that the call, "Hey you there," in any situation elicits a turning around when one ascribes some wrongdoing and therefore guilt to oneself. Butler says that there must be something that may be gained despite the self-ascription of guilt. The turn towards the law is not necessitated by the hailing, it is compelling in a less than logical sense because it promises identity. She writes, adding, "The readiness to accept guilt to gain a purchase on identity is likened to a highly religious scenario of a nominating call that comes from God and that constitutes a subject by appealing to a need for law, an original guilt that the law promises to assuage through the conferral of identity." The theory of ideology here seems to be supported by a set of theological metaphors. Although Althusser introduces the church as merely an example of interpellation, at the end of the ISA essay, Butler contends that ideology in his terms cannot be thought except through a metaphorics of religious authority. To conclude, therefore, we have seen how the ideological state apparatuses have in the capitalist economies ensured class reproduction through a very systematic way of ensuring the internalization of the value systems of the bourgeoisie itself through the schools, families, religion institutions, and other forms of social and cultural institutions. Thank you.